Hi, I'm Gabs and I write.
That could be anything. Well, okay, fine. Gabs, what writing would you like to talk about today? When you say writing, like I think about all the ways there is writing. And I'm like, what writing? Do you think of yourself as a writer of all the ways there is writing? Or is there a particular writing you are particularly deeply in love with?
Well, that's a good question. I think it kind of depends. I like the stage of my life and what's going on. I guess at my deepest center, I would say I write books.
Okay.
That's kind of, even though I've never officially published one, I did enter that movement that started a couple of years ago where people were like, don't hedge and be like, well, I like to sometimes write, but I'm not a writer. Just like, like own it. So I'm like, okay. So I write books. I write plays. I write short stories. And most recently, because I'm tired all the time and books are hard, I write a blog. So
Okay, that only leaves out, I mean, obviously there are all kinds of other writing, but the major thing it leaves out is poetry. Have you, when you were in school or when your own writing throughout your life, did you ever really get into poetry and try that for any length of time?
no, I am horrible at poetry. I am bad at reading it.
Wait a
I'm
second, you're
bad
bad at reading it? What does that mean?
understanding it. I am like English, as with many people who write, English was always my best subject, and the poetry section was always my worst section. I suck at poetry. I don't know what it is.
Is it, so is it the fact that if you're reading like a narrative, if somebody's writing a novel or even a play, like you understand kind of what's going on? Is poetry because they're going so many quote unquote layers deep? It's metaphor upon metaphor. It's so far apart away from the literal meaning of the words. Where's the part that you like feel like you're bad at it or you don't get it?
Well, I think, and this might just be like my personal hang up, is when I read a poem, I'm always like, I don't get it. And then someone's like, what don't you get? And I'm like, I don't know. Like I read that and it just seems like it's talking about green, I guess. And like, I guess like a poet would be like, well, there you go, you got it. And I'm like, but I don't like, I think the lack of formalization like wigs out that like analytical part of my brain, and I'm like, but I don't get it. So like if you
Yeah.
give me like a Shakespearean sonnet, I'm like, okay, I can like analyze the form, I can get the meaning, I know what he's doing. I feel like I get that. But then if someone hands me like more modern poetry, I
Uh-huh.
think a lot of it's beautiful, but I'm also like, I don't get this. Like poets' brains work on another level that I feel like my little brain just can't understand.
So tell me the way you write. How do you write? Because you've given it's awesome because you said you write books. So you're talking about writing novels and then short stories, plays, blogs, which is a lot of different stuff. How do you write?
You mean other than just like typing keys?
No, you can totally. If you have preferences, I have a huge obsession with keyboards. There's certain keyboards I love and certain keyboards I don't. We don't have to talk about that. But like, do you do it at a certain time? How do you come up with your ideas? Because my big struggle, actually, one reason I want to talk to you is fiction writing. I have I have an easy time just writing stuff off the top of my head that doesn't go anywhere. And the stuff when I see people who write books or novels or plays, I struggle with plots don't come to me. So how do you write? I mean, you're talking about writing a book, a ton of characters, a ton of stuff's going to happen. How do you do that?
Yeah. So let's see if I can. I don't really have like a process, but I'll kind of walk through. So
Okay.
I don't know, one thing that yeah, because we've talked about it before. The way I kind of got started was when a friend introduced me to NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month,
Mhm.
where you're supposed to write a 50,000 word book in a month. And it's basically just a way to force people to get words on a page, because so much of the time people just kind of agonize over like, did that sentence work? Did this paragraph work? Do I have this mapped out? What's going to happen? And if you're writing a book in a month, it forces you to just like vomit words on a page basically. And then at least you have something to work with. And I've discovered that is a way that is best for me in getting started. So usually what happens is if I'm like gonna write something or I'm like getting ready for like my next project, I'll come up with my ideas either like I'll usually think of like a scene. So I'll get like an image of like a character doing a thing. And then I'm like, okay, so how did they get there? And where is it going to go from there? And so that might be enough for me to just kind of get started and see what happens, depending on like where it falls. And I do usually like to start just by kind of going for a few chapters and seeing what happens just to start, because otherwise I totally get bogged down in the like, here's a blank page and now I'm terrified. Okay. And then I hit a certain point where I'm like, okay, I'm like gonna run off the rails and I have no clue what's going on. So now I need to like think about it a little bit. I know some people who do like super detailed outlines. I am not that sort of person, because the more detailed the outline gets, the more like boxed in I feel, and then I don't think I can like go organically. But so for example, the book I wrote during the pandemic, which we can talk a little bit more about, it ended up being like an adventure story where a group of college students were jumping through the worlds of different books. And so I just kind of started with the setup. They jumped into like their first book. And then I was like, okay, like now I need to figure out, how do you get into the next book? What does the connection have to be? How many books are they going to go through? And so I kind of sat down and just started thinking through like what different books they could enter and how they were connected and that sort of thing. And I just kind of had a list of like 5 or 7 worlds I kind of wanted them to go into. And then I was like, all right, and now I need to have like, they're looking for their missing professor. So obviously at the end, they need to find her. And what other sort of roadblocks I might like throw in a note of like, okay, in this world, they're going to run into this world roadblock. In this world, they're going to run into this roadblock. And at the end, they're going to figure out like, this was how they solved the mystery. And like, once I get a couple details in and kind of know where I'm going, I can get started again. And then usually at some point, once I've started like kind of writing those bits out, I'm like, okay, now I have a better idea of where I'm going. I'm going to go like fill out my outline a little more so that, because I know I start getting a better idea of the groundwork that I've laid and where I want it to go. And so it's almost like as I go, my outline gets more detailed because I've been setting everything up and I have a better and better idea of where I'm going. And I don't want to forget those things.
Okay, I'm fascinated. I want to ask about that because I'm picturing you. It feels like you found this balance because first so I come up with this idea and then I just start, I'm a little bit, so you're a little bit on fire and you go, but you don't go too fast, because if you go too fast, you don't know that you know where it's going. And so then you do a little bit of outlining. So it feels like you're very balanced between it needs to be organic and it needs to develop how it wants to develop. But then I make sure there's some thought that goes into it. It just feels like a good balance. And then this is why I don't understand it, because I compare it to my own process, which is just flaming on fire and then it peters out. And I think by your realizing you're going too fast, you stop yourself from doing that petering out, which is what I do. It's very interesting.
yeah, I mean, I've definitely petered out. I've definitely written outlines and then gotten halfway through and been like, this is, am I allowed to swear?
Yes.
This is shit. I don't want to do that. So I actually have a folder on my computer called Book Graveyard, where I tried to make an idea work and I just like couldn't quite get there, either because yeah, like I petered out on it. I was like, the idea is cool, but I just don't have enough of like the structure, or like in a couple cases I like put out a whole outline for myself and I got X amount of the way through the book and I was like, this outline is stupid and this is a bad way for the plot to go. And so I have a couple where like one day I might go back and like revamp it, or I might just leave it there forever. Because I also, this is another like very common thing for me in terms of like coming up with ideas. I'm very cyclical, where I'm like, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea. Like, here's the next 3 books that I want to write, or here's the next 3 blog posts that I want to write. And I'll like have my little list so I don't forget things. Because one thing I've noticed once I started keeping lists is I'll be like up, you know, with the baby in the middle of the night and I'm like, ooh, that's a great idea. And I open my list and I'm like, I already wrote this idea down. Like, not original, but I guess good thing I didn't forget it. But then I'll like be working on those things and maybe like the first 2 didn't pan out, or I decided I didn't like them, or I'm like done with them, or like whatever's happening. And I'm like, well, that was all my ideas. I guess I'm never going to have another idea ever again. And then something happens and I'm like, oh yeah, no, that could make an interesting thing. And then like I all of a sudden have a bunch of ideas again. So
you do have these periods where you even, I mean, you have the fear, even though you've been through this rodeo before and you've run out of ideas, you're like, this is the time I'm really out of ideas.
Absolutely. I was working on a book right before I had my baby. And it was an idea that I've had for, I don't know, 10 years now, probably. I'm old enough now that I'm like, 10 years ago, I was still an adult. So yeah, probably 10 years. I tried writing it a couple times. It didn't go anywhere. I finally sat down and was like, I'm going to give this one more try and see if anything happens. And if it doesn't, then this was just, it's never going to see the light of day, which is fine. And I was working on it and I got to the point where I was just outlining it because I decided that I didn't have enough brain space to finish a book before I gave birth. And I was getting toward the end of it and I was like, okay, well, here I am, like finishing out this idea that I've had for 10 years. I have nothing else on the horizon. I guess I'm like washed up. I'm just going to write a book for an idea I had 10 years ago, and I'm never going to write anything ever again. And then like, I don't know, a week later, I was like, oh, what if I wrote that? I had like a dream, which happens to me a lot. Like I wake up from a dream with a really strong impression of something. And I was like, what if I wrote a book about that? And all of a sudden, like, there I go. So
it's so you've been through these processes and you're refining them. Can you remember, how did you get started writing? Do you remember when you started writing and why?
Yeah, so the very well, I mean, I wrote like books as a little kid. If you ever did this like in the first grade, where like the teachers have you write and illustrate stories and then you staple it together and you come home and you're like, I wrote a book. I definitely did that. I had a story about like 2 cats having an adventure, and I'm sure it's just a nightmare. I wonder if my mom still has it. I'm not sure, but really the first like book, I guess, is I was like maybe like in the 5th grade, and I had this good friend. We like played together all the time. And she, for some reason, I don't remember how she decided she was going to write a book, but she was going to write a book. And she's like, you know, it'd be fun is if the two of us wrote books together, like, you know, wrote a book at the same time. And I was like, that
Yes.
does sound fun. Yeah, let's do that. Because when you're 10, like, whatever. And so she and I sat down and we both started trying to write books. And I wrote like a few chapters. She probably also only wrote a few chapters. And then we're like, this is harder than it is fun. Maybe, I don't know about this. And this is before, not before computers, but before I had access to a computer. So handwriting like in a spiral notebook. And
oh yeah, and your hand, the shaking of the hand because your hand's cramping and like,
yes,
yeah,
like writing, pretty sure my first one, like writing in pencil and smudging it everywhere. And yeah, and so that, I don't know, that one kind of petered out. And then I was doing something else and I was like, I know, I really want to try writing a book. And so I wrote this absolutely god awful book, filled up a spiral notebook about a teen girl whose parents were like ocean researchers, and this was in the future, and the water levels, instead of rising, were going down. So like it was a book on climate change where the oceans were going down, and her parents were like, all these animals are going extinct and the ocean is full of trash. And this girl, with the help of like a pop star that she meets, and they fall in love or whatever, because I was 11, the two of them like join forces and discover the way to like combat climate change. And then, you know, 5 years later, like the oceans are recovering and the world's getting better again. And I took it over to my friend's house and I was like, hey, I did it. And she's like, cool, I want to read it. And so I left it at her house, and her little sister, who was like 2 years younger than us, she like stumbled across this notebook one day while she was homesick, and apparently sat down on the couch and read the whole thing. And was like, I love, this is like the best book ever. I love this. Like, you're amazing. And I was like, holy crap, like, that's awesome. And so kind of off of that first little like success, I just kind of kept going. I wrote a few more truly horrendous. I think I have saved them for posterity, but they're all like complete ripoffs of other books that I liked, and just all garbage. But you know, just kept going. And then at some point I was like, this is awesome. This is like what I want to keep doing. So.
Okay. So you decided to become, did you decide I want to, as you transitioned from, so you're starting there at 10 and you're working your way through, you know, pre-adolescence and adolescence, did you decide I want to write novels for a living? Or did you just say, were you more, you know, separated? I want to write, but it doesn't need to be novel. How did you work? How did your transition happen to where you are now? Where, I mean, we were just talking about the fact that kind of compartmentalizing, there's things you can do at work that can be satisfying and wonderful. And maybe you can compartmentalize and keep your writing just in your spare time. What was your thinking? Did you want to be a big novelist or what?
I did.
Okay.
So when I was younger, I was like, I'm going to be a famous author and that's going to be my job.
Yes. Okay.
And it was mostly just as I got older and realized that, first of all, like being a famous author, like that's cute. Like I'm never going to be Stephen King. Which was like, I was like, I want to be like Stephen King or J.K. Rowling. Then I was like, okay, well, maybe not that level, but I could still be, you know, the level below that.
Yeah.
And I kind of just, as I grew up, realized like even a lot of really good, well-known authors that I love reading, like a lot of them still have day jobs or they had day jobs for a very long time, and it was only once they like were able to diversify through like,
Yeah.
you know, I write books and I go to cons and I do freelance, you know, like writing columns, and I feel like any author I know who just does writing also has to do a bunch of other things because it's not a lucrative career. And so I hit a certain point where I was like, okay, well, just like aspiring to be author is not really, unless I wrote a book that, you know, someone gave me like a $gajillion advance for, like,
Right.
that's not really going to happen. So I started transitioning to what else can I do that's like kind of in the same wheelhouse, because that's what I like to do.
And
So
did you do this in your 20s, or did you do this thinking in high school or before high school? When did you decide, you know what, author is not an easy career choice? So author is not going to be my career. I'm going to do something else.
I think I'm trying to think of when. So my undergraduate, I went in as an English major with an emphasis in creative writing. So I was still like, you know, I want to at least do this track. And I think it was sometime in college, where I started going, okay, like I have to do something in addition. So my plan as an undergrad was I'm gonna become an academic.
Ooh, okay.
Slash novel writer. So I wanted to be like an English professor slash writer. I was like, I'll do this. I'll transition to, you know, grad school and then my PhD, and I'll become an English professor, and it'll be great. And then I guess I'm going to date myself, but when I was an undergrad, I think it was my junior year, was the 2008 recession. And I had a couple of friends who were on the academic track, and I saw like how higher education started exploding, and like how the job market exploded, and just like everything went crazy. And I was like, oh, how viable is this exactly? And like I ended up double majoring and writing. My senior year of college, I wrote a 100+ page history thesis, a 40+ page English thesis, and a full-length play. And then when I graduated, I was like, I have no brain. I have no emotions. I don't know, like, I'm not a human being anymore. If I go straight to get my master's, I will like burn out in a horrendous way. So I had to take some time off and start reevaluating my life and what I was going to do. And
did that I mean, the recession's bad and that affects people differently. Did you feel like at this time, did you always feel like okay with mixing creativity with practicality? Some people would describe like things you're talking about. We know these people who have like these giant dreams, and there's the day their dream dies or the year their dream died. And you can tell these people are haunted, and then other people are not haunted. Was there a period where you felt haunted, or did you, as like the thing you just described, that's like a good sense of self-preservation and understanding. I have burned myself out. I need to take a break. I need to go another path. That sounds like some good self-reflection. And it doesn't sound like the dream dying. How did it feel? I mean, how does it feel in retrospect?
In retrospect, yeah, like I would say one thing that I'm good at is like I don't feel like I've ever like necessarily given up on some of the dreams I've had. Like they've definitely like morphed or changed.
Yeah.
But I'm never like, oh, this thing happened and now like that sucks. That's never gonna happen. I'm really good at like pivoting and saying like, okay, well, what am I gonna do now? And then when I look back on it, I'm just like, oh, that was kind of my first time where I had to adapt and change in order not to feel like everything, crashed around. And
right.
And I feel like I've had to do that several times. So I made that pivot. I took a couple years off and then said, how about publishing? And I went to grad school, and then, that was all wacky for a number of reasons. And then I pivoted again, and I said, well, I guess I still like to write. What about marketing? And now I'm like doing a completely different thing. And it's interesting because I think 20-year-old me might be like, wow, like, look at all that stuff I gave up. But as an adult, I'm really like, I feel like it's all good life experiences. You have to change. The world is so crazy. Like, basically nothing is guaranteed. Like, I'm sure another 20 years from now, I'm going to be like, well, that was way different than I expected. Is mostly what I've been learning is what life is that's just kind of what happens. So it actually feels very useful. And like, in terms of writing fodder, all this stuff that I've had to like change to just gave me better fodder for being a better writer. Like, so how bad can that be?
What do other people, so I love that your like a superheroine origin story is that you wrote this book and dropped it off at your friend's house, and then you had the very first fangirl who showed up and was like, I love this thing. Throughout your life, what have family and friends, what have coworkers, what do others think about this thing? Like, what do your parents think about the fact that you write? Did they always say like, Gabrielle's going to be a writer? Like, did it fit into their thing? What have people thought through the years?
Yeah, my parents are great and are definitely of the like, do what you love mold. My mom has read all of my books, and of course is like, telling everyone that I write great books. And then I remember specifically a book I wrote, like, honestly, like my freshman year of college or something. I like did a little illustration for like a cover for it, and my dad ended up getting it printed and bound and handing it off to like my aunts and uncles, and I was like, oh my god, what are you doing?
Wait, were you horrified? Was it like, you don't understand, that wasn't meant for prime time? Like, I did not mean.
It's not so much like, I didn't really mind other people seeing it, because it at least had been like, I had gone back through an editing process for it. But the illustration, I mean, like, I just kind of doodle. I'm not that good at drawing. I just kind of do it for me. And so that was sort of embarrassing. But then it was just like, the proud parent thing where like, anytime my parents are like, look at this thing, I'm always like, oh god. So they 100% like, I definitely think one day I will get my act together and get a book published. I just need to like get my act together and actually actively try to do it. And I think my parents will be like, well, we've been reading Gabs books since she was 13 years old. So they're, just embarrassing. And my friends have always like, I mean, I think that is one of the things that keeps me going, is that anytime I am working on writing, a lot of the time I'll like send my friends chapters as I write them, or I'll finish the book and I'll send it out. And I will say, like, if I send my book out to 20 people, I know like 2 of them are maybe reading it, because everyone wants to, but you get sent like 100,000 words and you're like, I don't have time for this.
Right. You're like, oh, Gabs is sorry, she did actually write a book. Oh,
yeah, like, I'm not messing around, guys. But it is cool just because like, kind of my community of people, I really like talking about it. And then people are always like, that's really cool. You write things. Can I read them? And so all just like the feedback and encouragement I've gotten from my friends over the years, where I did a thing for a while when I was younger, and I actually had free time where I would like write my friends short stories for their birthdays based on like story prompts they gave me. So you could get like personalized writing from me, and that sort of thing like was always super fun and encouraging. And then like most recently, this blog that I started, one of the nice things about it is it's easier for me to write because it's shorter form, but then I think it's also easier for people to read. So I have a number of friends, and then actually my mother-in-law who are subscribed to it, and then like I'll put a post out, and then I'll have people like texting and messaging me in the following days like, hey, I read your latest post, like I really liked this point you made, or like, how are you doing? Or so yeah, I think that definitely if I was just like in my own little void and I'm like, well, I finished another book and I guess there it is on my desktop, and like, no, I never talked to anyone about it or no one ever read it, then I would, I don't know how encouraged I would be to continue, but I have like a lot of cool people who are always like, show me your stuff, talk to me about your stuff, what's going on with your stuff. So
Are those people, do you have people in your lives, are these people who are encouraging of your art, they love your art, but they don't do their own stuff? Or do any of them have their own things? And does it kind of become that sort of artistic salon thing where people are sharing their own art? Or is it kind of people who don't do art themselves like it? Or a mix?
It's a mix.
Okay.
I would say I definitely do have some super talented friends who do stuff, and I do write with them sometimes, although a lot of them are much more disciplined than I am, where they're actually like getting short stories published, and then I'm just like, I'm just derping around over here.
Right.
But I have a couple good friends where I've definitely like exchanged stuff back and forth with them and gotten feedback and that sort of thing. But then I would say like my quote unquote biggest fans, I guess, are more just like people I know who don't necessarily like write themselves, but like to read, so they want to read my stuff.
Yeah. I don't know if you've thought about this before, but if somebody's listening to this, and I always wish people have like little artistic dreams in them, and if their little artistic dream is to write and they haven't done it since they wrote the 8 pages on elementary school lined paper and illustrated it and stapled it together for a first grade class book, what do you tell people if they think, I used to think I wanted to write? What advice would you have for people to get started again, figure out what they want to do?
Yeah. So I think like I'm thinking of a couple different things. I'm trying to think of which one I'm going to start with. So I think one of the things that's kind of tough is, and I think this happens with a lot of people, is you get the creative spark, you get started and you're all fired up, and then you hit a block and you're like, well, this is hard or not fun, or I don't know what to do. And then you just stop, and then, well, there you go. You have 20 pages of the book, and that's that.
You've just that in a very short time. That's the story of my life. So thank you for yeah, it's perfect. That's a perfect explanation.
And I think one of the things that like I kind of talk to people about is like, so I do think anyone who wants to write, totally capable of it, and you should go for it. So that's the first thing, is like, if you're like, well, I'm interested, but I'm not very good at it, or I don't have formal training, or I'm like, just go for it. Like, have a good time, give it a try. Like, you don't have to, by any means, you don't have to have formal experience. You just have to keep doing it. Like, if you could see the absolute mountains of trash that I have written, it is astounding, like how much bad writing I've done. And I'm sure I continue to do bad writing. It's just at a much higher level of bad than it used to be.
it's a high level of sophistication for bad writing.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, yeah. All right.
But I think the other thing is that a lot of people, when you think of like being a writer, they think, well, I have to write a book. And books are hard because they're super long and there's a lot that's involved. And so like to actually finish a book is difficult. And for someone who's just interested in like writing and having some fun, I actually think just trying to start by sitting down and writing a book is not necessarily a good idea. Because it just takes a lot of work. And I think we don't value enough like the fun creative writing that you can do, that doesn't become like a world-renowned book that you have to get published, right? Write a short story, like there are really cool books out there with just prompts and art and whatever in them, and you can just sit down and write a page or write a couple pages, and then the next thing you sit down to write doesn't even have to be at all related. Just like try to have fun, try to finish a short story. Writing 5 or 10 pages is much easier. And I think personally for me, until I finish a project, I tend to have a sense of like, I haven't done anything. So I've been working on this book for 6 months and I haven't done anything. And it's like, well, you've written 80 pages. And I'm like, oh, but it's not done yet. That's how my brain works.
So the lack of completion can be painful if you start and are working on a long project.
Yeah. I do that with work stuff all the time. I look at my to-do list. I'm like, I didn't do anything today. It's like, well, I did the first 3 steps of every single thing on my list. I just didn't have enough time to actually finish all of them. Like I did something. So if you start with just smaller goals and allow yourself like moments of accomplishment, or even if you do want to write a book and you just set the goalposts a lot smaller, any way you can give yourself a dopamine hit while writing, I encourage, because like after all that initial fun stuff, a lot of it is really just continuing to slog even while it's painful until it gets fun again. So
and I think that's probably hard. That thing you encapsulated in the beginning, it's hard to wrap your head around. When you think about writing, you think, well, this is something I want to do. And so probably people don't think about it like training, like, well, fine, you want to run a marathon, I understand that. But there's a lot of pain involved. And so people don't necessarily think with writing, there's pain involved, but there is psychic pain. You're going to experience psychic pain.
Yeah, if you ever want to see, just like go on Twitter and look for writers, and literally everyone is like, I should be writing today, but I spent 5 hours on Twitter. Like, just as a group, we are such a mess. And yeah, like the advice you hear, like published authors always say, just set a time to write every day and like just stick to it. And you're like, well, that's dumb. Like, I'll just do it when the feeling strikes. And when that happens, then you don't do it because there's so much other stuff to do. And it's like a really weird disconnect to realize this thing that I love doing is also somehow the thing I try to avoid doing at all costs. And
do you have any idea? Have you plumbed into that? Why is that? That happens with many things.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I mean, I think part of it is just because, once whatever spark or fuse or whatever stops, then like creative writing and writing for fun and with like stories and things you're interested in, like once it hits the point where it's not feeling just like fun and easy anymore, I think you have to come to terms with like, if you like to write, it feels like it should be fun and easy all the time. And then when it's not fun and easy anymore, then like your brain just starts throwing up all of these walls. And being creative on demand is really hard a lot of the time. And I don't think we realize that like writing a book is being creative on demand. And so you're like, what? Like, oh, I have to work more than I think I should to do something that seems like it should be fun and easy, and it's just not. It's one of those things where like the common perception of it is much different from the actual day-to-day of it, and your mind like rebels against it. So for me personally, like the advice of set time to sit down and do it is the only way I actually can make progress. Last year, I actually made a spreadsheet, which sounds like the least creative writing fun thing ever. And I said, my goal is to write 500 words a day. And if I miss a day, then I have to, make it up. And then I tracked my progress on a spreadsheet so I could see how I was performing against my goal, which I don't necessarily recommend for people unless you are a special brand of weird, because I know a lot of people that would just stress them out even worse. But for me, it was super helpful because I'm very driven by like concrete progress.
Yeah.
And that was super helpful. I did not sit down and write every day, but almost every day because of that. And I wrote so much more last year than I have, probably some years combined in my life. So I was like, fine, I'll finally do it. I'll listen to the actual successful published people and do what they say. And by Jove, it worked.
I think your example is perfect, where you want to do it when it's fun. And then how do you get over the hump when all of a sudden this thing you want to do is not fun? And then the other thing I think that's a huge problem is perfectionism. So the idea that this is supposed to be fun, when you're having fun, you feel like the thing you're doing is good. And then you're not haunted by the feeling that it's bad. When that energy runs out, you're sitting there looking at words that you acknowledge these words are bad. And the idea that the discipline necessary, you just have to keep writing. You'll get through some bad words and the words will become good again at some point. That's a hard slog to sit there with perfectionism and like, I want to do good words and these words are bad, but the only way to get to the good words is to keep writing these bad words. It's very frustrating.
It is very difficult, yes. And for perfectionists, it's like its own special brand of hell when you're like, I just wrote 3 pages that I know are all trash. And yeah, that's why like NaNoWriMo for me, I just like that mindset is something I try to apply when it gets hard and I don't want to do it and I feel like everything I'm writing is bad. I'm like, just get the words on the page and eventually like you'll hit a scene or a day or whatever where it gets all exciting again, and then you can go from there. So I know there are definitely people who prefer to like continue to craft and work on the paragraph until they think it's perfect, but I just can't operate that way. Like for me, it's much better to just keep plowing forward, and then when I go back and look at it later for editing, I'm just like, oh yeah, that day was really hard, and these 3 days, like these 3 pages where the characters just literally thinking about the same thing for 1,000 words, I can just distill that to 2 sentences and move on.
Everything you're telling me about discipline and writing is profoundly true, and I feel called out, and I don't want to face this reality, and I do not appreciate your presenting this reality, but I discern that it is in fact reality. I don't know what you're saying makes a lot of sense.
I see myself in this and I don't like it. That's me a lot of days on the internet.
So you just want people, I like the general advice. There's other advice. There's people who are a little more frustrated. Go find the thing you're good at, or there's all kinds of advice out there for people. But the idea that just to do it and then don't beat up on yourself. And then the other side of that is, well, if you do start liking this, you're going to have days where you don't want to practice guitar. You're going to have days where you don't feel like ice skating. You're going to have days where you don't feel like going out running. But the only way to get through those bad days is you can't go around them. It's that infernal truth that is so true and so painful. You have to go through them. You have to go through them. You can't avoid them. So you have to go through them. Otherwise, you'll just stop.
Yes. It's one of the reasons that I keep signing up for races, because I also run something I'm very
because you know you won't run if you don't sign up for the race.
Yeah. So I signed up for a half marathon in October, and in a couple of weeks here, I'm going to have to start my training. And yeah, like I've definitely had the days where I'm like, well, I have to run 8 miles today, and that hour and a half is going to be hell on earth, but like I gotta go do it. So sometimes I feel that way about my writing as well. I started a blog this year because I have a 6-month-old, and writing a book right now, I was like, I still, from post-pandemic burnout and baby and everything, like I just know I can't book right now, but I want to start writing again. So I was like, I'm going to do weekly blog posts. And I set myself, I've been trying really hard to get them all out on Wednesday. I've had to fudge a couple times. My one this week came out on Thursday, but the number of times it's Tuesday night and I'm like, I have to finish writing and editing and scheduling this blog post. And my husband's like, well, you don't have to. I'm like, I know I don't, like, no one's gonna like call me on Wednesday and be like, you missed your deadline. But if I don't do it, then, and I'm just like, yeah, I'll just skip this week and do next week. Then next week I'm going to do the same thing. And then all of a sudden it's, what was the statistic WordPress just told me? It was like 80% of blogs don't make it beyond the first month, because again, it's just the thing where you get all excited and a lot of ideas and you write your first 3 or 4 posts and then you're like, oh, this week I had all of these things happen and I didn't have time to get anything out, and like now my deadline's in 6 hours. Like, so I've been trying to apply that to this new venture as well.
My last question, it's an important question and it may not be interesting, but I am curious about that one thing. I hear the discipline makes sense. What do you feel like inside? What does it feel like to be you when you go too long without writing? So when you're too busy with family, too busy with work, or you're not feeling well, what does a stretch of not writing feel like?
Ooh, that's a good question. So let's see if I can, I don't know. It's going to be hard to verbalize, which is kind of funny because it's like, that's all I do is put things into words. But, okay, let's see if I can.
And the biggest reason I ask is because I hear you lay this discipline out to get this thing done. You, Gabrielle, write, and you figured out ways to kind of make yourself write when you don't want to. But then, there's that question underneath, which is, why are you writing? You don't have to.
Yeah, no, that's true. I could just stop. Some days I'm like, maybe the better option. Yeah, I actually did recently. I was like writing a little bio for myself, and I think I ended up writing that writing is a bit of a compulsion for me. And then I said, yeah, that feels like what it is that I have gone for stretches before where I don't. And I think it just makes me personally feel less like me. So I'll be not writing for a while, and I'll start thinking about the book that I abandoned or the play I want to do, or I'll come up with a story idea or whatever. And then I'm like, well, I don't really have time for that right now. I'm too tired, whatever's going on, I'm not going to do it. And I end up kind of building up this like huge well of like, oh, like guilt's not exactly the right word, but like, why haven't I done this thing in so long? Like, it's almost like this like kind of pressure like building inside of me. And I'm like, I just rewatched Battlestar Galactica. I had time to do that. I didn't have time to write. And sometimes I'm like, well, yeah, it's hard. I'm tired. Like, I haven't gotten it published, like whatever. But then I just ultimately hit the point where I start doing it again, because all this other stuff in my life that I love and am interested in, none of it can kind of quite get to that whatever itch I'm scratching through writing. Like,
yeah,
like the need to be creative for me is through writing. And I mean, so I think my most recent, I went almost 6 months at the beginning of this year, basically only doing writing for work and none of it creatively. And I think when I came into May, I was like, oh my God, like I burn out by everything. And the fact that I haven't been writing has actually made my burnout worse.
Yeah.
And so that's why I was like, I'm going to start this blog because it'll just give me the chance to do something. And so even then, like on Wednesday, if I stayed up till midnight to finish this post, then I was up with the kid at 2 a.m. and I got 4 hours of sleep.
Oh, God.
I'm exhausted, but I've never been like, man, I'm exhausted today. I wish I just hadn't written that article and gone to bed instead.
Oh my God, that is fascinating, because people do talk about there's I mean, what do you regret? And you're like, you don't regret that. You might regret many things, but you don't regret that.
Yeah. So yeah, like I think, everyone kind of has their thing, and absolutely, like if life has destroyed you to a point where all you can do is sit down and watch TV at the end of the day for 3 months straight, I've done it. No judgment, like live your life. But yeah, at some point I just kind of start going, well, I have, as an adult now with all this other stuff going on, I have a limited amount of free time. And so instead of trying to do all the things, I try to pare it down into like, what are the most important things? And so for me, I said, well, writing. And so I cut out television and started writing instead.
Yeah.
Because that's more fulfilling to me.
Yeah. Well, Gabs, I really appreciate your sharing all of this. It has been really helpful to me to hear all this stuff.
Yeah, and I have I have so much other nonsense I could throw at you, but
oh, if you want to, feel free to email me anything, and we'll put links up. Or yeah, if you want me to share anything, I would be glad to.
Like, do you want to do a 5-part episode? We can talk about playwriting. We can talk about doing a whole episode on NaNoWriMo. We can do, it's nuts.
Look, you are full of ideas. Again, this is so good for me because I have the way my creativity runs, and it is helpful to hear how other people's creativity runs, because I don't know, it's realize how you're different. You sort of, I don't know, I spend a lot of time comparing myself to different people and how they do things. And you can learn some things from them, and then other things, you figure out, oh, this is how I'm tweaked different, and that just won't work. So it's very interesting. Some of the stuff is this idea, especially of discipline. I struggle with that. I'm disciplined about certain things, but it's hard to be disciplined about something that's supposed to be quote unquote a labor of love. It's hard to be disciplined about that.
It is, and being a creative is really weird, because people are just like, oh, you get to do the thing that you love all the time, and you're like, it's actually really hard.
Exactly.
But then it sounds whiny to be like, writing this book was so hard, but it's goofy sometimes if you're talking to non-creatives and you're like, that book was really hard to write, and people are like, really? Like, you did it for fun, right? I'm like, well, yes, but yeah, I always try to something when I started running a few years ago. My husband is like an actual athlete and a really good runner, and goes out and does 10 miles in sub 7 minutes, and I can chug along at an 11:30 to 12-minute mile pace. And I used to look at all the elite athletes and just be like, man, I am not gonna get there ever, and it's so discouraging, and I guess I'm really bad at this. And the cheesy self-affirmation thing that really works for me is you can only compare yourself to yourself, because everyone is different and has different skills. And so if I ever am despairing about my writing, one way to really boost your mood is go read something you wrote 10 years ago, and then you're like, I am way better than that now.
That was a terrible Gabs. I cannot believe I was that Gabs.
Yeah, it's hilarious. And then sometimes I'm like, that's mostly bad, but I can see a few little sparks of me growing as a writer in there. So I mean, I don't know if that works for you, but comparing yourself to yourself is something I am always trying to admonish myself to do, because yes, everyone's brains work differently. So
well, apparently you will come back to discuss anything writing related for this podcast, which I'm totally stoked about. And so just in closing, I would say this was Gabs. And even though it's hard, she is compelled to write.